I used to believe that ink could free you. That all it took was a pen, a signature, and the sound of a courtroom stamp to unchain a woman from a man like Callum Fisher. I believed that the morning I left the courthouse with my hands trembling, the sun on my face, and a thin blue folder in my purse marked "Finalized." That was 2 years ago. Now I sit in the living room of a rented one-bedroom flat, clutching a letter addressed to Mrs. Callum Fisher. Inside is a bank statement for an account I never opened, a $48,000 loan in my name, and a signature I recognize too well. Mine. Only it isn't. You know your own handwriting like you know the lines on your palms. You know the exact curl of the J in Judith, how the F in Fisher loops low because you hated the name even when you married it. This wasn't my hand. It was an imitation, a disturbingly perfect one. I thought maybe it was a scam. But then came the property tax bill. Then the debt collection agency. Then the phone call from a woman in Colorado claiming she'd been contacted by me to co-sign a business loan. That's when I drove straight to the county records office. "There's no divorce record filed for you or Callum Fisher," the clerk said, peering through thick glasses at her screen. "Are you sure it was filed in this county?" "Yes," I said slowly, my skin going cold. I stood right here. I remember the desk. I remember the stamp. She tapped. Clicked. Sighed. Maybe it was never processed. That's the moment my heart began unraveling. Because I had trusted that it was done. That I had finally been free from a man who spent 3 decades draining me of self-worth, inheritance, and will to live. Callum never screamed. He didn't need to. He had a smirk that made your confidence bleed dry. He made me beg to use my own money, explained every betrayal with a half-apology wrapped in logic that made me feel guilty for asking. He'd say things like, "I didn't lie to you, Judith, I just didn't mention it." There's a difference. You don't need to control everything. But now, even in supposed absence, he was controlling everything. I tried calling his last known number. Disconnected. I contacted his old friend Martin, who told me he thought Callum had moved on with someone younger. Maybe to Belize. Maybe Oregon. No one was sure. But someone was using my name and his. Joint loans. Co-signed agreements. Rental leases. Credit cards. And legally, we were still married. The divorce was a lie. A cruel illusion. The signature I thought had set me free had been tossed aside. Or forged. Or maybe Callum had never even filed the documents. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall until dawn. What if he planned this from the beginning? What if this was his final game, to make me think I was free, only to leave behind a wreckage of financial destruction under my name, while he vanished into a new life with a new woman and a clean identity? That was when I found it. An old folder tucked inside my late mother's sewing box, under a pile of thread and buttons. A letter Callum had written to someone I didn't recognize. No date. No signature. Just his handwriting. A boastful tone. The perfect trick isn't faking your death, it's faking your divorce. No one comes looking when you vanish from a marriage that never officially ended. That was my proof. Not for the courts. Not yet. But for me. I'd been tricked. Trapped. Now I was going to trap him. But I wouldn't do it with lawyers or begging letters. I'd do it the way Callum taught me. With patience. With silence. And with a signature that looked exactly like his. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt trapped in silence or deceived in love, please like, comment, and subscribe to Whispers and Wills. I spent the next 3 days gathering every scrap of paper I'd ever had with Callum's handwriting on it. Old birthday cards, post-it notes he used to leave on the fridge, even that little journal he'd once kept during his meditation retreat phase before he realized fake spiritualism didn't pay as well as manipulating women. I didn't cry. Not this time. There comes a moment in a woman's life when your tears dry up, not because the pain is gone, but because the fire has taken over. I looked at every loop of his pen, every slant of his R, every careless flick he made on the lowercase t. And then I practiced. For hours. Days. I signed and re-signed his name so many times that I could do it blindfolded, breathing his arrogance onto every line. He wanted to erase me. But now I would become him. The next move was finding where he'd gone. I started where I knew he couldn't resist: real estate. Callum didn't believe in investing in stocks or crypto, he always said. People lie, but land doesn't. So I searched public records. Quietly. Carefully. It took me a week to find the first one. A small cabin in a remote Nevada township, bought just 4 months ago by a James Marlowe, but the deed listed a cosigner, Judith Fisher. My name. My trap. I called the local property office and asked for verification. They emailed me a scanned contract. There it was. My forged signature. The same curl in the J. The same slant I'd seen mimicked over and over in the debt notices. It was uncanny how well he'd studied me. How intimate forgery becomes when your abuser has watched you sign your name 1,000 times, on marriage licenses, bills, apologies. I knew I had to see the place. Not to confront him, not yet, but to learn. To walk the shadows he thought he'd hidden in. I arrived in Nevada under a different name, Marla Gaines. My new identity, complete with fake glasses, a gray wig, and a fabricated backstory about moving to care for my sick brother. The rental office didn't blink. The cabin sat on the edge of a dusty hill, surrounded by pine and secrets. It was quiet, almost too perfect. The kind of place you go when you want the world to forget you. But the world hadn't forgotten Callum. And neither had I. When I broke in the first time, he wasn't there. The place was cold, barely lived in, but there were signs. A toothbrush. A receipt for whiskey. A set of folded shirts, still in plastic wrap. And a notebook. He always had a notebook. Inside, notes. Scribbles. Code names. And something chilling. New marriage target. Heather B. Meet date. July 18th. New alias. Caleb Fletcher. He was planning it again. Another wife. Another fraud. Another life. That night, I returned to my motel room and couldn't sleep. The faces of Harriet and Fiona swam behind my eyes. Women he'd ruined. Women he'd drained. And how many more hadn't even realized yet? He wasn't just a manipulator. He was a predator. So I did what any desperate woman would do. I planted my own trap. I called the same leasing office Callum used to secure the cabin, and I asked to purchase a small shed, nothing fancy. Just something I could legally list under both our names. I forged his signature again, this time adding a business clause, joint ownership for cash-based antique resale. It sounded innocent. And then I filed it with the IRS. Loud and messy. The kind of filing that flags systems, alerts agents, draws attention. And I waited. 2 weeks later, a message came through the motel's front desk. Someone had tried to contact Judith Fisher at my old address, claiming she had defaulted on a warehouse payment. But there was no warehouse. It was mine. It was bait. And he had taken it. I knew he was circling now. Watching. I started spotting familiar signs. A black car idling too long at the gas station. A strange man pretending to jog past my window 3 times in 1 hour. He knew someone was onto him. But not who. I was going to play this like he played every one of us, carefully, quietly, with a knife behind my back hidden under a smile. And when he stepped into the trap, he wouldn't see me. Not until it was far too late. The first time I spoke to Harriet Caldwell, I was wearing the same fake glasses and wig I'd used in Nevada. We met in a dim cafe in the corner of Oregon, the kind of place where the waitresses don't ask questions and the coffee tastes like burnt memory. She was older than me by 5 years, but her posture was straight, her voice calm, almost professional. Until she looked me in the eye and said, his name wasn't Callum. He was Jonas Rivers when I married him. My heart didn't race. It froze. Harriet had met him through a grief support group. She'd lost her sister to cancer. He claimed he'd lost his first wife in a boating accident. He was charming, supportive, a gentleman, she said. Within 6 months, they were married. And a year later, he had left with her savings, her signed loan documents, and even a forged letter accusing her of elder abuse. She was still trying to repair her reputation. I have proof, she said, pulling out a folder. Inside, a marriage certificate, some vacation photos, and the signature I knew too well. His. And mine. Combined. Your name showed up in my debt file, she whispered. That's how I found you. I had to bribe someone to get your old address. And that's when we realized we were not the only ones. Harriet had found 4 other names on public records tied to Jonas Rivers, Caleb Fletcher, and Callum Fisher. One was Fiona Reeds, a veterinarian from Idaho. Another was Clara Hayes, a piano teacher from Vermont. All over 60. All smart. All careful. And all ruined by the same man in different masks. He married us in different counties, under aliases, sometimes even overlapping the timelines. He never filed divorces, just vanished and reinvented himself. But he always left one thing behind, a legal connection to his fraud. Debts. Loans. Mortgages. Co-signed by women who never knew each other, never met, and never understood how deeply they were being used. Until now. We formed a small alliance, quietly at first. Burners' phones. Encrypted emails. One rule: no one confronts him alone. We were building a case, not for the police, not yet, but for control. We weren't victims anymore. We were planners. I volunteered to be the face of the trap. Callum always liked me for my quiet obedience. He wouldn't suspect the woman who used to beg him for kindness was the one sewing his noose. Fiona tracked his latest identity in Utah, where he was posing as a widower with an online antique shop. The shop wasn't real, but the phone number was. Clara posed as a curious seller and scheduled a call. We recorded it. The voice was exactly the same, slightly hoarse, charming, full of pretend vulnerability. "I'm not good with numbers," he chuckled during the call. "But my late wife taught me enough to get by." Late wife. Which one of us was he referring to this time? The call confirmed everything. His aliases, his tone, his method. We mapped it all. His favorite excuses, lies, even the emotional stories he reused like templates. His boating accident wife. His tragic miscarriage. His love of rescuing strays. It was never love. It was performance. But now he was stepping onto our stage. Harriet and I drove down to a courthouse in Utah to register a fake antique business under the name C.F. Heritage, a name that would lure him in. The business was listed in my name and his. Another joint asset. Another breadcrumb. But this time, we also notified a contact Fiona had, an ex-investigator who now freelanced in tracking identity fraud. He didn't need to go to the cops yet. He just needed to watch. And we waited. A week later, the call came in from the lease office near the cabin in Nevada. A man had shown up, using the name Caleb Fletcher, asking questions about a warehouse tied to Judith Fisher. He was sniffing. I could almost feel the heat of his breath at the back of my neck again, like the old days when he'd corner me in the kitchen and whisper, "You'll never make it without me, Jude." But this time, he was walking into my kitchen. And the stove was already on fire. The day I returned to the Nevada cabin, the sky was covered in ash-colored clouds, the kind that hang over the desert like bruises waiting to bloom. Harriet stayed behind in Oregon. Her presence would spook him. Fiona monitored the paper trail through her contact in finance. Clara helped me from Vermont, sending letters to legal offices using her old alias to bait more activity. We were scattered, but united. I had packed light, a burner phone, a tiny voice recorder, a few cash cards, and a worn red sweater Callum had once bought me in Paris during the good phase that he made sure I remembered every time he gaslit me. The cabin looked the same as last time. But now I noticed small changes, curtains shifted slightly open, a different lock on the shed, fresh tire tracks that hadn't been there a week ago. He was back. I waited until dusk, when the golden light bled into shadows and the mountains stood silent like they were holding their breath. Then I slipped around the side window. I already knew he kept a hidden ledger under the loose floorboard near the fireplace. That was Callum's flaw, he couldn't help keeping records. He loved watching the ruin he left behind like trophies. I peeled the board up. There it was. This ledger was newer. Inside, names, cities, dollar amounts. Beside each woman's name was a cruel little note. Trusts easily. Asks too many questions. Might fight back. I was last on the list. And beside my name. Thinks she's free. My hands shook, but I kept reading. One address matched the new antique shop in Utah. Another matched an account in Harriet's town. He was tracking us. Even now. Even still. I didn't hear the car pull up. But I heard the key in the lock. For a moment, I froze. My breath caught in my throat like a scream held hostage. Then, pure instinct, I slid behind the fireplace nook, just in time to see the door creak open. Callum walked in like he owned the silence. Hair slightly grayer, a limp he hadn't had before, but the same energy, calculated calm. He wore a brown leather coat I remembered from our 3rd anniversary. He used to say it made him feel undetectable. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment, then looked around. I could tell. He felt something was off. Then he spoke, low, to himself. "Judith." Not a question. A taunt. My hand slipped into my coat pocket. I pressed record on the device. He moved to the table and pulled out a folder. "You should have stayed gone. I gave you peace." My heart pounded like a war drum. "You just couldn't leave well enough alone," he murmured. "But that's all right. A little fire always makes the next version cleaner." He was going to burn it all. The files. The house. Me. I waited until he lit a cigarette and turned toward the door. Then I slipped out from the shadows, stepped into the center of the room, and let him see me. His face turned as pale as smoke. "Hello, Callum." "Jude." He blinked once. Twice. Then laughed. "You look older." "I am. So are you. But your tricks haven't aged well." He looked down at my hands. "You came alone?" I didn't answer. "You always were too sentimental," he said, stepping forward. "What's this, an intervention? A reunion? You think they'll believe you over me?" I smiled slowly. "They already do." He reached for the table, probably for the ledger. I held it up. "Looking for this?" That broke him. His smirk dropped. "You don't know what you're doing." "Oh, I do," I said, voice steady. "And so do the 4 other women who now know your name in every language you've spoken it in. Jonas. Caleb. Rivers. Fletcher. Fisher." His body tensed. "You stupid woman." That's when I pulled out the second object. The framed business registration under our new names. The one that linked us in a fraudulent antique partnership that triggered IRS suspicion. "I hope you like federal mail," I whispered. "They'll be here soon." He lunged. But I was ready. I smashed the frame across his chest, not glass, just cheap wood, but it stunned him enough. I ran. Out the front, across the dirt. Behind me, I heard him shout, curse, chase. But he didn't know I'd slashed his front tires. He didn't know the neighbor was a retired sheriff Harriet had tracked through a friend. And he didn't know that this time, I wasn't running from him. I was running toward the final blow. I sat in the sheriff's kitchen, sipping weak coffee from a chipped mug, while the old man stood on the phone in the next room, talking in clipped tones to his contact at the state investigation unit. The retired sheriff's name was Hank Grayson, Harriet's distant cousin, quiet and slow-moving, but sharp in the eyes. "He's a ghost, all right," Hank had muttered earlier when I handed him the forged paperwork. But even ghosts leave footprints if they're stupid enough to wear the same shoes twice. Callum hadn't shown up back at the cabin after the tire slash. He'd vanished again. But I had the ledger. The audio recording. The business license with his forged signature. And now, finally, a witness willing to vouch that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But something still wasn't right. He'd run too easily. He never ran without laying traps. And Callum's favorite move was always this: make you think you'd won, then cut the ground from under you just when you thought you were safe. The phone call ended. Hank came back into the room, face tight. "We've got a problem," he said. "State investigator confirmed your paperwork's flagged. But someone already filed a motion yesterday to freeze all assets tied to Judith Fisher, including your bank account, retirement, and that little trust fund your mother left." I felt like someone had pressed their hands around my throat. "How?" I whispered. "How could he, someone pretending to be your legal husband, filed on your behalf? Claimed you were under psychological duress. Requested a protection order against yourself." I couldn't speak. My chest was burning. "He's trying to erase you again, Jude," Hank said softly. "He's not hiding anymore. He's eliminating you. Legally." For a moment, I thought I might throw up. I pressed my hand against my chest and closed my eyes. But then I remembered the ledger. "I have names," I said, voice sharpening. "And not just the women. His bankers. A notary who rubber-stamped every one of his fake marriages. A lawyer who changed his name in Idaho twice. I have everything. And if he's playing legal games now, then I'm going to bury him in paperwork. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was furious. That night, I made 4 calls. Harriet, Fiona, Clara, and the investigator Fiona had pulled into our circle. Together, we assembled everything: notarized signatures, time-stamped calls, marriage overlaps, property frauds, loan thefts. I filed a motion of my own. Not through my name. Through his. I forged Callum's newest alias, Caleb Fletcher, and used it to apply for a second fraudulent business license in Utah, linking him to a fake antique import scheme involving unclaimed goods. I included the address of his last known wife, the woman he had marked as Heatherby, in the ledger. I didn't know if she was real yet, but I knew this would trigger an audit. The trap wasn't a warehouse this time. It was his ego. His inability to leave a scam half-finished. 3 days later, I got the message from Clara. He took the bait. He'd returned to Utah under the Caleb alias to clear his name. Filed a new affidavit at the county office, trying to disassociate himself from the antique business. But the notary? She was working with Fiona now. The whole process had been recorded. The moment he stepped in with a fake ID, it triggered a red flag. Then the IRS stepped in. Then interstate fraud investigators. And then, finally, a call from a blocked number came to my burner phone. I answered, heart steady. "You did this," he said. His voice was lower than usual. Less smug. More hollow. I didn't answer. "You think they'll believe you after everything I planted?" he growled. "After the doctors, the letters, the debt, the proof that you're unstable? They don't need to believe me," I said calmly. "They only need to believe your handwriting. The one I perfected." Silence. Then, a sound I'd never heard from Callum in all our years together. Breathing. Heavy. Uncontrolled. Fear. "I didn't want to destroy you, Jude," he muttered. "You did this to yourself." "No," I said, voice sharp. "You taught me how to disappear. But I decided to come back." And then I hung up. The line between hunter and prey had been blurred long ago. But now, for the first time, he wasn't the one holding the map. And I wasn't the one running. 2 weeks passed. 2 slow, deliberate, bitter weeks. And in that time, I didn't go home. I didn't sleep in my bed or water my plants or sit at my window like I used to. I lived inside paper trails, digital records, and legal loopholes. Because that's where Callum lived now too. He'd stopped chasing with fists years ago. Now he chased with forms, with impersonations, with carefully stacked lies that looked like truth to anyone who didn't know how he played. But I knew. While the IRS opened a case on the antique business and the fraud unit traced his forged filings across states, I dug deeper, not into Callum, but into the version of me he had created. I went to the county clerk's office in Salt Lake City under another alias and requested public files tied to Judith Fisher. At first, the woman behind the desk said it would take a few days. But then she tilted her head and said, "You've already submitted 3 copies of this request." "No," I said, careful. "I'm new to town." She looked confused. "Well, someone using your name and social security number already came last month. And again 2 weeks ago. It was flagged because they listed different mailing addresses each time. You might want to look into identity theft." I forced a smile. I just might. The woman he had created, the shadow of me, had already been here. She'd left traces I could follow. I walked out with a file of documents and sat under a rusted metal awning in the park nearby, flipping through every sheet. My name was on car registrations, utility bills, even a therapy reimbursement form from a clinic I'd never been to. And then I saw it. A letter from a psychiatric hospital in Arizona confirming Judith Fisher's 72-hour observation stay after an episode of delusional paranoia. Dated 3 months ago. Signed. Stamped. And completely fake. I called Harriet immediately. "He's laying groundwork for a full erasure," I told her. "Soon he'll file to have me declared mentally unfit. He's done it before to one of his other wives, remember Clara?" "Yes," she said, voice low. "He used her breakdown against her to seize her house and freeze her bank account. That's what he's doing to me." He's building a case not to disappear, but to erase me completely, so when they finally catch him, he can say I was complicit or insane." Harriet paused. "Then we don't wait anymore." That night, all four of us gathered on a video call: Harriet, Clara, Fiona, and me. Each face reflected a different kind of pain. Fiona had her hand wrapped in a bandage, still recovering from the stress-induced fall she'd had last week. Clara looked thinner than ever. Harriet was scribbling notes, her face tense. "We strike first," I said. "We go to the press. To the fraud unit. To every woman's network willing to listen. We show them the pattern." "But will they believe us?" Clara asked softly. "I mean, it's so elaborate. It sounds like a conspiracy theory." "It is a conspiracy," I said. "But it's also truth. And I have his handwriting on 20 different signatures to prove it." Harriet leaned in. "So what's the plan?" I showed them. I had drafted a timeline, a meticulous chart mapping Callum's movement across 7 states, matching aliases to dates, bank loans to forged signatures, and marriage licenses to simultaneous property purchases. Every step was supported by documents we had pulled. But there was one final name missing from our list. Heatherby. The woman he was currently courting. The one we'd seen mentioned in the ledger, scheduled for meet date July 18th. Today was July 17th. If he follows his pattern, I said, he'll meet her somewhere public first. Charm her. Then vanish for a week and reappear as her new savior. We stop that before it begins. Clara had already found a lead. She'd run Heatherby through community boards and senior clubs in Utah and narrowed it down to a retired librarian named Heather Bloom, age 66, widowed, just joined a dating group. We couldn't risk spooking her. But we could show up before he did. I booked a ticket to Utah that night under another alias. Sat in the back of the plane, hands clenched, heart racing not with fear, but with rage. Because Callum hadn't just stolen years from me. He hadn't just drained my bank account or used my name to commit crimes. He had stolen my identity, my voice, my sanity. Now I was going to take it all back. And this time, the trap wouldn't be made of paper or ink. It would be made of truth. The Utah air was dry and crisp when I stepped off the bus in the small town of Willow Spring. Quaint little place. Too trusting. The kind of place where a man like Callum could stroll in, smile once, and walk out a week later with a woman's entire life in his back pocket. I found Heather Bloom at the public library where she volunteered on weekends. She had soft white curls, clear eyes, and a kindness in her voice that made my stomach twist with grief. She reminded me of myself. Not who I used to be, but who I could have become if I hadn't spent decades second-guessing my instincts and signing away pieces of myself to a man who never truly looked at me, only through me. I approached her table cautious. "Excuse me, ma'am. Do you happen to know a man named Caleb Fletcher?" Her eyes lit up like someone had turned on a switch inside her. "Oh, yes. I met him through a friend. He's very sweet. Reserved. He helps with antique sales." She lowered her voice with a shy smile. "We're supposed to meet tomorrow, actually." I sat down slowly. "Please don't. I know this will sound insane, but you're in danger." She blinked, smile fading. "Excuse me." I reached into my bag and pulled out a small stack of papers, photocopies of marriage licenses, business fraud reports, forged signatures, news clippings, and a printed still from one of the surveillance videos Clara had recovered. The photo showed Callum, posing as Caleb, standing beside another woman, arm wrapped tightly around her. Heather stared. Her fingers trembled. "I don't understand." He said he lost his wife to cancer. That he was looking to rebuild. That he didn't want my money. "He doesn't want it," I said softly. "He steals it. Quietly. With forged documents, co-signed accounts, and properties he ties to your name before disappearing." Heather pushed her glasses up, but her eyes were wet now. "Why would anyone do this?" "Because he never learned to be anyone else. He collects women like investments. We're portfolios. He drains us and walks away clean." Her voice broke. "I thought he saw me." I reached across the table. "He did. He saw your gentleness. Your trust. He saw everything good in you and decided to use it." We sat in silence for a long time. Then Heather did something I hadn't expected. She straightened. What do you want from me? I looked her in the eye. I want to stop him. I want to end this cycle. And I need your help. She nodded once. Tell me what to do. We built the trap that same evening. She texted him from her phone, pretending nothing had changed. The plan was simple: meet at a local cafe at noon. She would wear a navy blouse. I'd sit nearby recording. The moment he showed up, I'd trigger the call to the investigator who had already informed law enforcement to be nearby. The cafe was called Maples. Sunlit and small. I arrived early and took a seat near the window. Heather entered shortly after, with a steel calmness I hadn't expected from someone just shattered the day before. At exactly 12:04, he walked in. I knew the shape of him before I even saw his face. That quiet, controlling walk. That smug aura disguised under warmth. Callum Fisher, this time dressed in pale blue, hair combed back, eyes full of practiced tenderness, walked in and kissed Heather on the cheek. She flinched. Slightly. He didn't notice. He sat across from her. Smiled. Spoke softly. And then his eyes drifted. Past her. To me. His jaw clenched for a split second. Then he smiled wider. Heather, darling. I'll be right back. He stood. Walked toward me. You really don't know when to quit, he said under his breath, leaning close. I learned from the best, I replied, voice like stone. You're ruining innocent lives. You're stealing them. He chuckled, but I saw it, his eye twitch, the tightness in his fists. I stood. You're not walking out this time. Oh, Jude. He leaned in close, voice colder than I'd ever heard it. You still think this is your story? I tilted my head. It was never just mine. And now it's being written down, word for word. I pointed discreetly toward the door. 2 officers entered the cafe. Callum's face didn't fall. He didn't panic. He simply smiled, slow, cruel, and said, "It's not over." But it was. He turned to run. But Heather stood, quiet, calm, and planted her hand firmly on his chest. "Sit down," she said. For the first time in our history, a woman told Callum Fisher to stay. And he did. They cuffed him without resistance. He didn't yell, didn't thrash, didn't even act surprised. Callum always had a gift for slipping into new skins, and now he wore the role of the wronged man like a tailored suit. As the officers led him out of Maples, he turned his head toward me and smiled like it was all some inside joke only we understood. But this time, I wasn't the punchline. Heather sat across from me again after it was over. Her fingers were cold, wrapped around a cup of untouched tea. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "Thank you," I said. She shook her head. "Don't thank me. I nearly became the next version of you." Her words stayed with me long after we parted. Callum was taken into custody in Salt Lake City that evening. The local authorities held him for initial questioning, but he wouldn't talk. Not even under the weight of forged IDs, overlapping marriage records, and now video surveillance footage from the cafe. He played his favorite game, silence and smirks. But the thing about men like Callum? They always think they're smarter than the people around them. They forget that the longer you play a role, the more likely you are to leave fingerprints on the script. And this time, we had the script. The following morning, I met the fraud investigator, Dominic Wells, at the county courthouse. A quiet man, mid-50s, with a collection of coffee stains on his shirt and files thick as bricks in his briefcase. He spread out every piece we'd gathered, the ledger from the cabin, marriage licenses under multiple aliases, property deeds tied to overlapping dates and stolen social security numbers, screenshots of forged emails, voice recordings, psychiatric reports falsely submitted in my name. "You understand," Dominic said, tapping his pen slowly. "This isn't just identity theft. This is engineered erasure. He wasn't just stealing money, he was stealing existence. You're not the first. But if we win this case, you'll be the last." I stared at the files. It looked like a life exploded across a table. Mine, Harriet's, Clara's, Fiona's, and now Heather's too. I whispered, "We should have stopped him years ago." "No," Dominic said, surprisingly firm. "He should have been stopped years ago. You? You survived. That evening, we shared the evidence with the other women. We didn't call it a victory because we weren't there yet. Callum had been arrested, yes. But court cases like this took time. And he had lawyers. Probably hidden accounts. Maybe even another identity tucked away for when things got tight. But we had something else now, each other. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. Didn't feel like I was screaming into a void. We began drafting formal statements. I helped Clara write hers. She couldn't bring herself to type out the parts about how he'd drugged her, made her think she was losing her mind so she'd sign over her house. Fiona worked with Dominic to trace payments and offshore accounts tied to Caleb Fletcher. Harriet coordinated with media contacts. This story wouldn't stay buried. And me? I started writing everything. Not for court. Not even for closure. But for every woman who would never get the chance to fight back. My fingers flew across the page every night, what he said, what he did, what he made me believe, and what I finally remembered about myself. I wasn't weak. I was conditioned. I wasn't naive. I was groomed. I didn't stay because I was stupid. I stayed because he built a world where leaving felt like suicide and staying felt like sacrifice. But I did leave. And I came back. With names, with records, and with a mirror held up to a man who only ever saw women as shadows. Dominic called me on the third day of holding. He's finally talking, he said. What's he saying? That you're lying. That you forged everything. That you're unstable. He's sticking to the script. Of course he was. Then let's flip the script, I said. I was ready to testify. The day I walked into the courtroom, the sky was overcast, silent, gray, almost cinematic. I wore a dark green coat, not because it was cold, but because it had once been my mother's. It made me feel like I had roots in the ground. I needed that. Because facing Callum in front of the world required more than facts and evidence. It required nerve. He was already seated when I entered. Clean-shaven. Wearing a beige sweater over a collared shirt. Harmless. That was his look now, harmless old man. Widower. Victim of bitter ex-wives with a vendetta. He didn't glance at me. That was his new move, pretend I didn't exist. But that's the problem when you try to erase someone. The more you ignore them, the louder they get. The prosecution began with paper trails, legal fraud, multiple aliases, overlapping marriage records, financial theft. His forged identities alone could fill a filing cabinet. But the defense was slippery. She has no psychiatric evaluation to prove stability, they said. She's forging signatures herself now, they accused. She's manipulating other women into ganging up against him. It didn't matter that every woman had documentation. That our testimonies were consistent. That video surveillance caught him in lies. Callum's lawyer kept turning it back to me. That I had orchestrated all of it. That I was the jilted wife trying to destroy a man who'd moved on. The courtroom didn't flinch. That was the worst part. Most of the people there didn't feel. They took notes. They blinked. They waited for objections. But they didn't see. Not until Harriet took the stand. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She simply told them how Callum, posing as Jonas Rivers, came into her life after the death of her sister and slowly convinced her to sell her house, co-sign a business, and start fresh. When she found the fraud, she'd already lost everything. Fiona went next. Her hands trembled the whole time. She told them how he used a fake therapist to convince her she was bipolar. How he stole her medication and made her think she was hallucinating financial documents that were actually real. Clara's voice cracked during hers. She'd signed away power of attorney believing it was to ease the stress of home management. She was hospitalized for months afterward while he emptied her accounts. And finally, Heather. She looked him straight in the eye. You almost had me. You called me your safe place. You asked me to help you build a life. All you really needed was my name on a lease. The silence after she spoke was the loudest moment of the trial. Then it was my turn. I stood, walked slowly to the stand, looked over the crowd and tried not to think about the fact that I had once loved the man sitting across from me. When you sign your name at a wedding, I began, you don't expect to be signing the death of your identity. I told them about the divorce that never existed, about the paperwork that vanished, the loans I never took, the phone calls from creditors, the debts that weren't mine. I told them about the psychiatric report he filed behind my back, trying to claim I was delusional. I told them about finding his ledger, and how the name Heatherby was the final straw. I finished with this. He didn't just steal money. He stole our voices, our realities. And the cruelest part? He almost made us think we did it to ourselves. I stepped down without looking back at him. The defense cross-examined us like we were unreliable memories, like older women were inherently confused. But we had proof. So much proof. And strength they hadn't counted on. By the end of the week, the court had enough to bring full charges: federal fraud, identity theft, multiple counts of bigamy, financial abuse, criminal impersonation, psychological coercion. Callum sat still as the charges were read, still playing the part, still hoping the courtroom wouldn't believe us. But this wasn't just about belief anymore. It was about truth. And we had finally spoken ours in one voice. When the judge read the verdict aloud, guilty on all counts, the courtroom didn't erupt in gasps or clapping. There was no dramatic closure, no sweeping orchestra behind the final blow. It was just a thud. A sentence delivered like a knock at the door. 25 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole for 15. Callum barely reacted. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He folded his hands in his lap and stared at the floor like it wasn't real. Like he was somewhere else entirely, maybe planning his next identity, one that would never come. The bailiff led him away. I didn't watch. I didn't need to. His chapter in my story was closed. But mine was still wide open. And the truth was, freedom didn't feel the way I expected it to. After everything, I returned to the little apartment I had moved into after our divorce. The place was quiet, clean, almost sterile. I stood in the center of the room for a long time, unsure of what to do. No more lawyers. No more recordings. No more aliases. Just me. And silence. It hit me harder than anything Callum ever did. I wasn't who I used to be. I couldn't go back to gardening and window reading, to neighborhood walks and charity bake sales. I'd seen too much. I'd lost too much. I didn't recognize myself in the mirror anymore, and that wasn't a bad thing. I wasn't the obedient wife. I wasn't the erased woman. I wasn't even just a survivor. I was a documented storm. But storms don't last. They pass. And then the work begins rebuilding. The other women kept in touch. Harriet went to live with her niece, who helped her get back on her feet. Clara began giving talks about financial abuse in elder communities. Fiona started counseling women who were afraid to leave abusive marriages. And Heather? She sent me a letter 2 weeks after the verdict. Judith, I think about that cafe every time I walk past it. How close I came to becoming another ghost in his ledger. You saved my life. So now I'm going to use it. Whatever years I have left will be louder than the decades I spent quiet. Let's make sure we weren't the last. I held that letter to my chest and cried. Not the kind of cry that leaves you broken. The kind that clears space inside you. And then I began again. Not by forgiving him. I wasn't ready for that, not yet. Maybe not ever. But by forgiving myself. For not seeing it sooner. For staying too long. For believing I needed his permission to leave. Callum tried to make me forget who I was. So now, every morning, I write a page to remind myself. Memories. Moments. Lessons. Not of what he took, but of what he couldn't. My name. My story. My voice. They're mine again. And no man, no matter how clever, how cruel, how many names he hides behind, will ever take them from me again. Because I'm not disappearing. I'm reappearing. The morning sunlight poured softly through the blinds of my new apartment, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the hardwood floor. For the first time in years, I felt the quiet without fear, no lurking threats, no whispered threats behind closed doors. But silence wasn't peace. It was space. Empty, raw, and waiting. I sat by the window, pen in hand, and began the hardest chapter of all, the one where I talked to myself honestly, without excuses or blame. I wrote of the nights I endured, the moments I gave up, the small victories I never celebrated. I wrote of Callum's lies and the years he tried to steal. But mostly, I wrote of the woman who refused to disappear. Reclaiming my voice wasn't a single act. It was 1,000 quiet decisions to speak, to myself, to others, and finally, to the world. Soon, Harriet called with news. She was speaking at a community center, sharing our story with women who'd lived in silence. Clara had started volunteering at a financial abuse hotline. Fiona was leading support groups. Heather? She was writing a memoir. We weren't just survivors. We were a movement. And for the first time, I wasn't alone. I closed my notebook, feeling a strength I hadn't known I possessed. The past might have shaped me, but it would never define me again. Because sometimes, the greatest revenge is simply reclaiming your life, one word at a time. The silence that had grown between me and my family over the years felt like a thick fog, heavy, cold, and impenetrable. After Callum's final arrest, it became clear to me that healing wouldn't come from legal victories alone. The wounds cut deepest at home, where love should have been a refuge but instead had turned into a battlefield strewn with misunderstandings, accusations, and painful distance. For years, I'd shut the door on them, not out of malice, but out of shame and fear. Shame for what had happened to me, and fear that they would see me differently, or worse, believe Callum's versions of the truth. The years of manipulation had twisted our family narrative, turning me into the villain in their eyes while Callum played the perfect victim. I hesitated, fingers trembling as I dialed my sister Anna's number. Her voice was tentative when she answered, soft but distant. Anna, it's me. Jude. Her silence stretched a moment before she whispered, Jude? I didn't expect to hear from you. I know, I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. I'm scared, Anna. Scared of facing you all, of what I lost, and what I might never get back. I'm here, she said finally, her voice steady. We'll get through this together. That conversation opened a crack in the wall between us. Slowly, one by one, others reached out. My brother, who had been distant for so long, called with a trembling apology for turning a blind eye. My son, once cold and distant, tentatively asked to meet, unsure of where he stood but willing to try. Even distant cousins and old family friends expressed their support. I invited them all to a quiet dinner at my apartment. I wanted to rebuild, not to reopen old wounds, but to weave new threads of trust and understanding. The evening was filled with tentative smiles, halting conversation, and tears that came unexpectedly. We spoke honestly about pain, regrets, misunderstandings, and hopes. My sister admitted how Callum had poisoned their perceptions, telling stories that painted me as unstable and selfish. My son confessed his confusion, the impossible position he was caught in between loyalty to his father and his mother's fading presence. Others shared their guilt for not seeing the signs, for believing the lies, for letting me bear the burden alone. It was painful, yes, but it was also necessary. That night, surrounded by family, I felt something I hadn't in years: belonging. The broken pieces of my past didn't vanish, but they began to fit together in a new way, less jagged, more whole. In the quiet moments after they left, I stood by the window and looked out at the city lights shimmering in the distance. This was just the beginning. The hardest part wasn't the battle with Callum, it was reclaiming the love and trust one thought I had lost forever. But I was ready. The days that followed that dinner with my family were heavy with silence and unspoken questions. The fragile truce we'd formed felt like walking on cracked glass. One wrong step, and everything might shatter again. But the weight pressing on my chest wasn't just from past betrayals. It was from the slow, painful unraveling of stories that Callum had rewritten to suit his twisted narrative. One evening, the phone rang late. I recognized my sister Anna's number, but hadn't spoken to her in months. When she answered, her voice was fragile, trembling with the kind of grief that had been bottled up for too long. Jude, she began softly, I've been carrying something I need to tell you. Something I should have said years ago. I held my breath. Callum, he lied to all of us. He made us doubt you. Told us you were unstable, that you were the problem. I believed him. I'm so sorry. Her words cracked like breaking glass inside me. For years, I had wrestled with self-doubt, wondering if I had failed as a wife, a mother, a sister. But hearing her confession, that my own family had been caught in Callum's web, tore through the loneliness like a brutal gust of wind. "It wasn't you," I whispered. "It was him all along." Anna sobbed softly into the phone. We were so blind. Over the next week, more calls came. My son's voice was raw when he reached out, admitting how trapped he'd felt between his loyalty to his father and his love for me. He confessed his confusion, his silence, his fear. "I didn't know what to believe, Mom. I just wanted the fighting to stop." I listened, tears streaming down my face, and told him what I'd longed to say. "You were a boy caught in a storm not of your making. It's not your fault." But it was more than my family. I realized the destruction Callum wrought wasn't limited to me. It seeped into every corner of my life, infecting relationships, clouding memories, and distorting truths. One afternoon, overwhelmed by exhaustion and aching for closure, I found myself in the attic, surrounded by relics of my life before Callum. Boxes filled with old photographs, letters unopened for decades, and mementos of a time when love had been simpler and trust unbroken. Amid the dust and faded memories, I spotted a leather-bound journal, worn at the edges but still intact. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside, the pages revealed Callum's handwriting, neat, calculated, chillingly cold. His entries detailed his plans, his lies, the ways he manipulated everyone around him like a puppeteer. He wrote of me not as a person, but as an obstacle, a pawn to be controlled or discarded. The journal chronicled every scheme to steal identities, to fracture families, to erase women like me. Yet beneath his calculated facade, I glimpsed something else, a man broken by his own demons. Desperate, isolated, haunted by failures he couldn't admit. Reading those pages was like looking into a void, a mirror reflecting not just his cruelty, but his fragility. The hurt was raw and sharp, but I refused to look away. Because if I was to reclaim my future, I needed to understand the darkness that had shadowed my past. Closing the journal, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and resolve. The past wasn't something I could erase, but it was something I could learn from. And finally, I was ready to write the next chapter. The leather-bound journal sat heavily on the kitchen table, its weight like a silent accusation. I traced Callum's inked words with trembling fingers, reading through the cold, clinical descriptions of every manipulation he had orchestrated, the forged signatures, the hidden accounts, the lies fed to my family to isolate me. Each page felt like a fresh wound reopening, but with every word, I also felt a strange sense of clarity settling in. He had thought his control was absolute, that his intricate web of deceit was unbreakable. But his greatest mistake was underestimating the strength that lies dormant in those who refuse to be silenced. I began piecing together a plan, not just to fight in court or to protect myself legally, but to shatter the silence he demanded of me and every other woman he had touched. His power was built on fear and secrecy. The moment those walls came down, his empire would crumble. I called Harriet that evening, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "It's time. We stop hiding. We speak. Loudly. Everywhere." Harriet didn't hesitate. "I'm with you. Let's bring every story out of the shadows." In the weeks that followed, I transformed from a hidden victim to a fierce advocate. I began volunteering at a local women's shelter, sharing my story carefully at first, then with increasing boldness. Each time I spoke, I felt the invisible chains loosen. I wrote articles for local papers detailing the insidious nature of financial and identity abuse, especially how it targets older women, leaving them isolated and vulnerable. The feedback was overwhelming. Calls and emails poured in from women who saw their own pain mirrored in my words. Clara joined me, her fragile voice gaining strength as she spoke at community centers about recognizing signs of coercion. Fiona began organizing support groups, giving women a safe space to share and heal. Even Heather, once nearly lost to Callum's lies, started penning a memoir, determined to give voice to those who had been silenced. Through it all, my family's support was a balm. Anna stood by me, helping organize events and raising awareness. My son, once distant, became my quiet ally, learning to listen and understand. We were no longer isolated islands, but a connected force. The healing was uneven, some days filled with hope, others with tears and anger. But the path forward was clear. In quiet moments, I revisited Callum's journal. I saw not just his cruelty, but the brokenness that fueled it. It reminded me that while he had been my tormentor, he was also a prisoner of his own fears and failures. My journey wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life on my terms. And with every story shared, every truth spoken, I was breaking the chains he had wrapped around me. The day of the final hearing arrived with a weight that pressed down on me like a storm cloud refusing to break. I woke early, the light still soft and gray outside my window, and dressed carefully, not to impress the courtroom, but to armor myself with quiet strength. The dark green coat, my mother's gift, settled around my shoulders like a shield. Walking into the courthouse, I could feel eyes flicker toward me, some curious, others skeptical, a few sympathetic. But I had learned to tune out the noise. This was no longer just about me. It was about every woman Callum had tried to erase, every voice he had silenced, every life he had tried to steal. The courtroom was cold and sterile, every surface polished to a shine that reflected the tension thick in the air. Callum sat at the defendant's table, his face smooth and composed. The years had weathered him, but his eyes held the same calculated coldness I remembered, a predator waiting for a chance to slip free. The judge began by outlining the charges in detail: federal fraud, identity theft, bigamy, financial abuse, criminal impersonation, psychological coercion. Each accusation landed like a hammer strike, echoing through the silent room. The weight of decades of pain and betrayal hung between us, palpable and undeniable. Callum's defense attorney rose, his voice oily and practiced. He painted me as a bitter ex-wife with a grudge, someone desperate to punish a man who had moved on. They called into question my sanity, my motives, and the veracity of every document we presented. But the truth could not be undone with empty words. One by one, Harriet, Clara, Fiona, Heather, and I took the stand. We recounted the years of deception, the stolen identities, the shattered lives. We shared not only our pain but our resilience. Our voices, once quiet and uncertain, now rang clear and unbreakable. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, steadying myself with a deep breath. I looked directly at Callum, then at the jury, then at the judge. When you sign your name on a marriage certificate, I began, you don't expect to be signing away your identity, your dignity, your very existence. I told the courtroom about the divorce papers that never were, the forged psychiatric reports, the debts that weren't mine but haunted my credit. I spoke of the ledger I found, the women whose lives were tangled in his web of lies. I finished with a quiet but firm declaration: he did not just steal from me. He tried to erase me. But I am still here, and I will not be erased. The defense tried to undermine us, but the evidence was overwhelming: handwriting analyses, financial records, video footage, expert testimony. The judge listened intently, weighing every word. After days of testimony, the moment of truth came. The judge's voice was steady but carried the gravity of justice. On all counts, the defendant is found guilty. Callum's face twitched, just a flicker, before settling back into an expression of hollow calm. The bailiff led him away, the heavy clank of the handcuffs echoing like finality. As the courtroom emptied, I felt a weight lift from my chest, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and something new, hope. But the real victory wasn't the sentence handed down that day. It was the walls I had torn down inside myself, the shame, the silence, the fear. I wasn't just a survivor. I was a storm that had broken through the darkest night. The courthouse doors closed behind Callum with a finality that still echoed in my mind days later. The metal clang of the gates locking away the man who had haunted my life felt like a punctuation mark, an end to a nightmare I had endured for far too long. Yet, as the adrenaline faded and the crowds dispersed, a new, more complicated feeling settled in, a stillness that was both comforting and unsettling. Freedom, I learned, was not an instant gift, but a slow, unfolding process. Back in my apartment, the silence was overwhelming. The constant tension I'd carried for decades, the tight coil of fear wound so deep it had become part of me, had suddenly unspooled. But without the looming threat of Callum, the quiet wasn't peace. It was space. Vast, empty, and unfamiliar. The first few mornings I woke up, the absence of his shadow was like a hollow ache. I found myself reaching for the phone to call for help, to ask advice, or simply to speak, only to remember there was no one to call. No abuser to placate, no lies to navigate. I had to learn how to be alone with myself again. The nights were harder. Memories crept in with sharp edges, the screams muffled behind walls, the whispered threats in darkened rooms, the suffocating loneliness that made every breath a struggle. Sometimes, I'd sit by the window watching the city lights flicker, tracing the patterns like a roadmap back to a life I once thought was lost forever. Slowly, I started small rituals, things that felt foreign but necessary. I watered the small plants I had neglected, letting the act of nurturing life remind me of my own capacity to grow. I kept a journal, not just to recount pain, but to capture moments of hope and strength, no matter how fleeting. Therapy was a mountain I hesitated to climb, but with Harriet's encouragement, I made my first appointment. Sitting across from Dr. Morgan, I bared years of silence, the hidden scars of emotional and financial abuse, and the raw wounds left by betrayal. Healing was not linear. Some days I felt like a warrior, others a shattered woman barely holding on. My family became my lifeline. Anna visited often, bringing warmth and the steady presence I craved. My son, once distant and unsure, began joining me on walks, sharing stories of his own struggles to reconcile the father he knew with the monster we'd uncovered. And then there were the women Harriet, Clara, Fiona, Heather, who had become more than friends. We formed a circle of resilience, meeting regularly to share victories and setbacks, reminding each other that our strength was born in our shared stories. One afternoon, as I sat with Heather over tea, she looked at me and said, "We're not just survivors anymore, Jude. We're something stronger. We're a force." Her words resonated deeply. We had transformed from victims into advocates, from shadows into light. The scars remained, a testament to battles fought, but they no longer defined us. Each day, I took another step forward, reclaiming parts of myself Callum had tried to erase, rebuilding trust, and rediscovering joy. Freedom was no longer a distant dream. It was my new reality, fragile but real. And in the quiet, I found my voice again. The road to healing was far more complex than I had imagined. The legal battle was over, the abuser behind bars, yet the echoes of the past lingered quiet but persistent, like shadows stretching long at dusk. Though I was no longer his prisoner, the scars he left were not only visible in the bruises I hid or the documents I reclaimed, but etched deeply in the unseen corners of my mind and heart. The trauma had become part of me, woven into the very fabric of my being in ways both subtle and overwhelming. Sometimes, the simplest moments triggered a storm, a sudden noise, a phrase, or the faintest scent that transported me back to those years of fear and betrayal. On more than one occasion, I caught myself flinching in empty rooms or jumping at a harmless knock on the door. My mind, ever vigilant, had learned to anticipate danger even when none existed. Therapy sessions with Dr. Morgan became a sanctuary where I could unravel these tangled feelings. It was exhausting work, peeling back the layers of denial, shame, and guilt that had masked the pain for so long. I learned about PTSD, triggers, and coping mechanisms. I began to understand that healing was less about forgetting and more about reclaiming control, about choosing how those memories shaped my life going forward. But beyond the therapy room, I faced other challenges, rebuilding fractured relationships with my family, navigating social stigma, and confronting my own doubts. Some relatives whispered behind closed doors, questioning the truth of my story or blaming me for staying so long. The loneliness of disbelief cut just as sharply as the betrayal. Yet, in the midst of this, the sisterhood I had found in Harriet, Clara, Fiona, and Heather grew stronger. We were bound not just by shared pain, but by fierce determination. Together, we started a support group for women who had suffered similar abuses, creating a safe space where stories could be told without judgment and strength could be nurtured. One evening, After a particularly difficult session, I sat with the group, watching these women, some older, some younger, all grappling with their own ghosts, yet showing up every week to face them head-on. I felt a profound sense of purpose. What Callum had taken from me, I was now giving back to others, a voice, a community, and hope. Still, the scars were real. Some nights, I woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, caught in nightmares where the past replayed mercilessly. On those days, I reminded myself that healing was not about perfection but persistence, taking one step, however small, toward peace. I learned to be gentle with myself, to celebrate progress instead of perfection. I learned that strength was not the absence of fear, but the courage to move forward despite it. And slowly, painfully, I began to believe that my story was not just one of survival but of transformation. Months had passed since Callum's sentence, yet the ripples of his betrayal still touched every part of my life. The legal battle was a closed chapter, but the real fight, the one for my own peace, was ongoing. It was a battle fought in quiet moments, in conversations with family, in therapy sessions, and within my own heart. I had come to understand that truth was not just a weapon against lies. It was a lifeline, a thread that connected me back to reality, to myself, and to those who truly cared. I began writing again, but this time not just for myself. Inspired by Heather's memoir and the stories shared in our support group, I started compiling a collection of letters addressed to the women I had met, to those still trapped in silence, and to the daughter I had once been before Callum's shadow fell over my life. Each letter was a testament of resilience, a declaration that no one deserved to be erased or silenced. I poured my heart into the words, revealing my darkest moments alongside the small victories that had rebuilt me. One chilly autumn evening, I held a gathering at the community center where our support group met. The room was filled with women of all ages and backgrounds, some newly arrived, others veterans of survival. We shared stories, tears, and laughter. It was a tapestry of pain and hope, woven together by the simple act of speaking truth. When it was my turn, I stood before them and read a letter titled "The Power of Truth." My voice trembled at first, then grew stronger with every word. Truth is not just a thing to be spoken. It is a force that breaks chains, heals wounds, and lights the darkest paths. It is the armor I wear now, forged from the ashes of lies and betrayal. The room was silent, but the energy was electric. Faces softened, eyes glistened, and a sense of community blossomed. That night, as I walked home under a canopy of stars, I felt something I hadn't in years, a profound connection, not just to others, but to myself. The truth had set me free. And with that freedom came power, the power to shape my own story, to reclaim my voice, and to help others do the same. The months following the community gathering unfolded like a slow dawn, bringing light to corners of my life I had long kept in shadow. I had reclaimed my voice, rebuilt fragile bonds, and found strength in sisterhood. But the reckoning was still ahead, a confrontation not just with the past, but with the final pieces of Callum's dark legacy. One afternoon, I received a call from the detective who had worked tirelessly on my case. His voice was steady, but I could hear the weight behind his words. "Jude, we've uncovered something you need to know. Callum's web of deceit runs deeper than we thought. There's one more woman, young, vulnerable, and still trapped in his lies." The news hit me like a sudden storm. I had thought the nightmare was over, but the shadows lingered, reaching out to pull others in. Determined to prevent another life from shattering, I met with the detective and together, we contacted the woman, a fragile soul named Emily. Her story was eerily familiar: promises of love, whispered lies, financial control, and isolation. I reached out to Emily cautiously, offering support and an open hand. At first, she was wary, scared of yet another betrayal. But slowly, trust grew. We met over coffee, her eyes wide with disbelief as I shared my story and the truth about Callum's manipulations. In those moments, I saw myself reflected in her fear and hope. The fight was no longer just mine, it was for every woman who had been silenced. Together, we began unraveling the threads of Callum's final deceit. We gathered evidence, spoke to counselors, and connected with law enforcement to ensure Emily's safety and freedom. The process was exhausting but empowering. For the first time, I was no longer just a victim. I was a protector, a guide, a beacon. When Emily finally broke free from the chains that bound her, her gratitude was a balm to my soul. Her courage rekindled my own, reminding me why I had endured. The reckoning was more than legal justice. It was a reclaiming of power, a passing of the torch from one survivor to another. As I watched Emily step into her own light, I knew my journey was nearing its end. The past had shaped me, but it no longer controlled me. I was ready for whatever came next. The journey that began in shadows had finally brought me here, standing at the edge of a new dawn. The courtroom battles, the broken relationships, the nights filled with fear and tears all felt like distant echoes now. What remained was something far more powerful, hope reborn from the ashes of pain. With Emily free and safe, the last thread of Callum's influence was severed. But my path was no longer just about survival, it was about purpose. I dedicated myself to advocacy, speaking at conferences, writing articles, and partnering with organizations to create awareness about financial and emotional abuse, especially among older women. My voice, once silenced by fear and betrayal, became a beacon for those still trapped in darkness. Each story I heard, each woman I met, reminded me of how far I had come and how many still needed light. The community we built, Harriet, Clara, Fiona, Heather, my family, became my second family. Together, we formed a network of strength, compassion, and unyielding resilience. There were still scars, some visible, others hidden deep within. But scars, I learned, are not just reminders of pain, they are symbols of healing and survival. On quiet evenings, I sit by my window, watching the city lights flicker and fade into dawn. I write letters to my younger self, words of encouragement and love I wish I had heard long ago. And sometimes, when the night is still, I smile, knowing that despite the darkness I endured, I rose. I rose not just to reclaim my life, but to inspire others to rise with me. The past shaped me, but it did not define me. My story, one of betrayal, pain, and ultimately triumph, is a testament to the unbreakable spirit that lives within us all. And as I close this chapter, I do so with gratitude, strength, and an open heart, ready to face whatever future awaits. Because I am not just surviving. I am thriving.